to Reproducibility, an open science podcast featuring early career researchers. I'm Sarah, she, her. I'm based at the University of Lincoln, where I'm grateful to live and work as an immigrant on this land. My relationship to it is as the land of the people who colonized the land on which my family settled, and that I've called home for most of my life, which is so-called Canada.
Hi, it's Will again. I am currently a lecturer at the University of Adelaide, and I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people whose custodianship of the land that I work and reside on, and like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their custodianship, both past, present, and into the future. In today's podcast, we're very excited to have Josh de Leeuw, who you might know from creating jsPsych. So Josh, would you like to give a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Josh de Leeuw. I am associate professor at Vassar College in the cognitive science department and the program in neuroscience and behavior. And yeah, I'm here to chat about jsPsych and things related.
Super excited to get into it. I'm excited to be back. I've not been on the podcast for a while, so I'm glad to be getting back into it.
Yeah, welcome back, Sarah. So this episode we're going to chat generally about jsPsych and talk about some things including recognition of scientific software or creation of scientific software and the process behind that we sometimes take for granted that we don't really see. So yeah, I guess a good place to start, Josh, is do you want to give us a bit of history on how jsPsych came about? Like what brought you into creating this awesome, wonderful software and tool?
Yeah. So the project started as just a project for myself. I was in graduate school in 2010, 2011. This was a time when the sort of adoption of Mechanical Turk as a subject pool was really starting to take off. And there weren't available options yet for sort of frameworks to build an online experiment in of the kind that I wanted to build, which were sort of your classic cognitive psychology, stimulus and response kinds of experiments. So I happened to have a lot of experience as a web developer from my childhood as a child of the early internet and GeoCities and all those great things.
Amazing.
So this is actually a skill set that I had and one that I enjoyed playing with. And so I decided to create a set of tools that I could use sort of just for myself and be able to run these kinds of experiments. And as I was doing that, a lab mate said, "Hey, you should think about making this something that other people could use too." And I think that they were genuinely meaning that in the charitable way, but also I think they wanted the tools themselves too. So I started expanding sort of the user base, almost literally geographically. It was the folks that sat next to me in the lab at first. And then it was the lab across the hall, and then it was like the lab down the hall, and then it was sporadically within the building kind of thing. And then eventually, of course, I started doing a workshop here and training session there, and now it's being used globally.
Yeah, amazing. So maybe some listeners might be unfamiliar with jsPsych. You're probably best to explain. I could try, but you're probably the best to explain what it is, like how it works, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So it's a tool for building experiments that run in a web browser. The dominant usage is for running online, remote behavioral experiments, but lots of folks use it also as just kind of the in-lab experiment software as well. Once they learn it for online experiments, it makes sense to use it in lab. There are tons of amazing tools that lots of people have developed for doing experiments, and I tend to think of them as all just different kinds of options that appeal to different kinds of researchers with different kinds of ways of working. What tends to separate jsPsych in terms of like the user experience and workflow in it is that it's structured around an idea that we tend to sort of repeat tasks within our experiments quite a bit as psychologists and cognitive scientists and other behavioral scientists, right? So when we're designing a study, it's, do this one thing 100 times with some different kinds of stimuli, along the way. And not only that, but like if I'm going to run one study today, the study that I run a year from now is probably also going to use something very similar to that same protocol with some adaptations and twists. And not only that, but I'm also probably basing this off of somebody else's work that came before me. And so there's just a lot of reusability in how we structure and code and build these things. And so when I started building it, I was building it with that kind of structure in mind. So in other experiment software, you might do something like have a blank screen and you drag, a box onto it and say, this is where the image is going to appear. And here's where the button is going to appear. And that's great for certain kinds of designs and certain kinds of workflows. In jsPsych, the way that it works is you say, for this particular task, I'm going to use this sort of mini template of what an image with a button response, for example. Like I just need to show an image and I need to show a collection of buttons. And so all I need to do is say, I'm going to use an image button response template, or we call them plugins. And you as the researcher provide information to the software about what's the image and what are the button options and other things like, is there a time limit? How long do you want it to go for? And stuff like that. And these plugins are things that there's lots of them that sort of ship with jsPsych, things that you can just download. I think there's roughly 50 of them in the repository now. And they're everything from sort of very generic, like, show an image and get a keyboard response to it, to things that are, much more specific but common designs. Like there's one for doing a visual search task where all the search items are arranged in a circle on the screen. And you can set that up without having to sort of manually create the circle. You just say, here are the stimuli that I want to use for this kind of experiment. And I think that the advantage of working this way is that once you have a paradigm established and once you have a sort of a protocol established for it, it becomes really easy to jump into a new design that reuses parts of that system. And then I'm getting a little long-winded here, but I guess the last piece of this would be that these plugins, not only are they things that we can ship with sort of the software as we share it, but they're also things that researchers can build themselves. So if a plugin doesn't exist for the kind of thing that you want to do, we have a guide and a tool that will help you construct a new plugin. And then you can share that with the research community. So there's been a number of researchers who have published papers where they've said, hey, we've built this new feature for jsPsych, and here is a methods paper about that particular kind of plugin that implements something that didn't currently exist.
Yeah, really cool.
That last bit sounds to me like the really, really interesting or unique selling point for jsPsych, because like the reusability stuff, I've used ePrime, I've used PsychoPy, and I basically just edit the experiment that was before. I do not create anything from scratch. Why would I do that? I just edit files and switch things out. But we don't have the capacity with those softwares to create our own stuff. It doesn't exist. Too bad.
Yeah, and I think what you'd have to do with those kinds of workflows is sort of have different experiments that you're editing or putting together in some way. And that could totally work and be a usable solution for a lab. And I just think this is a different kind of model where you're kind of you're sort of programming at two levels. So one level is a kind of programming where you're saying, this is the kind of level where I say, this is where the image goes on the screen, and this is where the buttons go on the screen, and this is the kinds of things you can do. And then we take all that and we abstract it and say, okay, now you've got this object, this plugin that defines that way of working. Now other users can go and modify it, or you can modify it yourself in your code to make it more like when you're writing the experiment, you're more writing the things that are related to the methodology of the experiment. And the things that are a little less related to the, the kinds of details that we might report in like a method section, those tend to be the things that are sort of exist in the plugin themselves, like exactly where, or exactly how big something is, or exactly like what CSS classes are applied to the buttons and control how they look and stuff like that.
Right, so that's a language that like scares me a bit. So saying programming, code, CSS, and I'm like, how much coding skill do you actually need to have to operate this? Because I don't know where I'm coming this from, but I feel like is jsPsych, is that JavaScript?
Yeah.
Is that why that's okay? Yeah. So I see that and I go, nope.
Yeah.
And because I do some code. I use R, but I'm not a coder.
Yeah.
So how much of using JSPsych requires coding skills? Or is it more of a like visual drag drop thing?
Right. So there's no visual drag drop. This is a tool that requires you to open up some kind of text editor that is like, say, working in R. But I will say that it's it's one of these things that has sort of progressive layers of complication that you can get into. If you wanted to teach a undergraduate student who's in their first research methods class to put together a visual search experiment, to put together a Stroop experiment, whatever the case may be, those are all things that you could sort of, the code that you would be writing to do those would almost feel like you're just describing the structure of the experiment in like slightly fancier syntax.
Okay.
And then, if you want to get to the point where you're able to customize things and be able to write your own, custom procedures and plugins that are working for this, yes, then you need some background in JavaScript. But I think there are lots of researchers who have essentially gotten their first coding experience through working with jsPsych, and it's a tool that I think lends itself to that kind of early career, like early coder kind of researcher who's needs to learn these skills in order to be able to do their research. And that's always been part of our target audience, is to think about how do we make this like usable for that person when they need
researchers who can code, not coders who do research.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a difference there, right? Yeah, I'm a researcher who can do some coding.
Yeah,
there's a limit to that.
Yeah, and you're that makes you the kind of person that we would want to make sure that jsPsych is usable for.
Yeah.
As someone who has been that, I can totally vouch for the fact that I felt jsPsych was quite accessible, and it's truly, it does feel in a way like, as you would describe an experiment in a method section, like writing it out and mapping it out, even with boxes and arrows. That's the sort of workflow that you get from programming jsPsych. Like, oh, this box goes here and I need this box to do this thing, and then that leads to this thing. And it's so in the jsPsych lingo, it's the timelines. You create this timeline that like organizes how the experiments run. It's not so different from writing a method section on how each step is run for a trial, for example. And so I totally get that that workflow. And I think like many other cognitive scientists, when the pandemic hit and we were like, oh, we need to run online studies now, that's when I started to sort of pick up and learn jsPsych. I would call myself a more competent programmer. Maybe I shouldn't, but I don't have that barrier, I guess, because I'm across many languages. But I did find it very straightforward to sort of pick up, and even the tutorials on the jsPsych website are pretty good. Like the Hello World tutorial sort of like gets you enough of the way to like sort of code up a simple experiment. So I wanted to vouch for that. One thing I want to go back to. Oh, go ahead. So go ahead, Sarah.
I might look into it then. I've been looking for like another possible open source software to like adopt in my lab now. I'm sort of trying to figure out what I want to be using moving forward more often. It just then becomes a question of like, do we have that software on our network at the university, and like, would they be open to adding it also? But I'll look into the jsPsych some more.
Okay, well, I'll say to that point, all that you have to do to start using jsPsych is open up a text document, and there's a little template that we have on the website, and you can sort of copy the template, and then you can the template basically loads some files, and those files are just publicly available on the internet, and so you don't need to install or download or put anything on. All you need is a web browser. So if you have, any web browser on your device, you can just open up that file that you create, and you'll have your experiment. The caveat to that, and the thing that does make it a little more complicated than I'm selling it as, is that jsPsych by design only handles part of this problem, right? So if you want to run an experiment, you need the thing that lets the participant do the task and measure the things that you want to measure, but you also need some way of saving the data. And that is something that jsPsych doesn't provide out of the box. And that was a deliberate design choice, because there are many ways that people want to be able to store and structure their data. And committing to one of them would have sort of expanded the scope of the project quite a bit, and also would have sort of limited the use cases to things that sort of share that kind of data structure. So there are lots of solutions out there. There are other open source projects. JTOS is a great one that sort of support jsPsych and have documentation for how you can use jsPsych with it. But it is often sort of the hiccup for first-time users, is thinking about how do we want to structure and save data in this lab, and how do we want to set up that infrastructure.
I miss being able to do that. My very first few experiments that I coded were in MaximSP. And what I liked about it is I could fully control what the output was. So I would just have a file that was organized exactly the way that I wanted. It would go into R, and I didn't have to do any wrangling, cleaning.
Yeah.
Whereas things like E prime and CyclePy, the text file is a mess. You have to really, now that I have the code, I edit the same code just based on, the new project. But it's, once you figure that out, you're fine. It's just not its step. It's not that big a deal. Right. But I do miss being able to organize the data the way that I want. Here are the columns, here's the information I want to organize it in this way. It's going to make me a file, and that'll be it. Yeah. That'll be done.
One thing I want to go back to is what I'm generally curious about is what it was like for you when the pandemic hit, and then there was suddenly a rise in demand for being able to run online studies, especially for people who were used to doing studies in lab only. I imagine you would have had an influx of people trying to figure out how to use jsPsych, and you would have had an influx of help me and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So what was the experience for you, and what kind of things occurred that kind of lend itself now to being easy to pick up?
Yeah, that's a great question. Fortunately, it was far enough along in 2020. So at that point, I had been working on it for 8 years, and had done, it was a stable product that lots of people were using, and so it was kind of ready for the increase in users that happened. And the other really fortunate things that happened around that was that it was the first time that I got external funding to support jsPsych. So I was lucky enough to get an award from Mozilla through their open source support program, and that allowed me to hire someone to work on the project. So Becky Gilbert was phenomenal, core maintainer of jsPsych now, and is now a member of the team that runs Children Helping Science, or Look It, out of MIT. She worked on the project with me for about a year, a little more, and that was right during that time. So she was able to really help me manage the load that happened then. And then I also with Josh Hartshorn got an award from the NSF to conduct a workshop to do some training for people who suddenly needed to move their research online. And we recorded, we did live workshops via YouTube streaming for 5 weeks, once a week. And those recordings are still on YouTube. They're still actually pretty good as introduction to some of the material. And they've been viewed, many thousands of times now.
Yeah, so awesome. A thread through this that I find very intriguing and definitely relevant to the open science movement is some of the decisions to like make this open source and sort of shared for everyone. It sounds like you've got this attitude like, yeah, everyone should come in and use this and like you implement this thing I've created themselves. In my more darker, cynical times, I would think of creating software and licensing it and selling it so that I have, passive income to create to fund my research and my life. But you've clearly gone away from that direction, which I resonate with.
Yeah.
What were some of the sort of design decisions and thought processes behind that?
I would love to say that this was purely altruistic for the love of good science and all of those things. And I think that's partially true. And I also think that I'm just partially terrified of being like a business person and entrepreneur. So I don't know. I'm not sure I have the mindset for that. So I'm also fortunate in that I was able to get a faculty position. I'm now tenured, and this gives me a lot of flexibility to work on these kinds of things. I have a salary that is not really directly paying for jsPsych, but in some ways it is, and it's allows me to do this kind of work and share it as open source and free open source software without really needing to use it as a source to financially support myself. If I had struck out on the job market, things might be different, right? I might have tried to spin it off into some sort of venture or something like that.
Yeah, interesting. So, aside from the financial sorts of things, how has this shaped your academic career? From my lens, trying to encourage things like contributorship rather than authorship, where we recognize some of the more less explicit contributions to research. For example, maybe it might be going out and getting a special population and building the bridges to bring them in to do research, or opening up those opening up those doors, those bridges. Or it could be research technicians who are specialized, who help collect the data and definitely necessary for the research project. But again, they don't get recognized typically because of authorship. So another place for this is software contributions. So how has that shaped your academic career, and what is your thoughts on the how it's recognized in our structures?
Yeah, I have been. I've had these lovely experiences at meetings and conferences where people will come up and say, like, you're doing this amazing thing for the field. Like, thank you so much for supporting the lab and like the work that we do. And, the reality is that what's needed is just recognition of the kinds of work. Like, if this is this kind of thing that people are excited about, and this is the kind of thing that we want to encourage more people to be able to do and have a career where the main thing that they are sort of known for and recognized for and base their, promotions and just tenure decisions off of is things like developing scientific software, then we should probably figure out ways to credit that in a way that people recognize as being just as useful as writing a great journal article. And I think to the credit of lots of users of this kind of product, people do tend to cite these things when they use them, especially if you ask for that. I think there's an interesting case where the more well-known something becomes, the less likely it is that people will bother putting the citation in. So there's definitely lots of cases out there where people will say, we use jsPsych, and there's not a citation attached to it. And that, that's fine. It wouldn't be my first choice, but it's still a kind of credit. But I think it's, we do this in other cases too. So think about the analyses that you do in R. How often are we taking the time to cite all of the packages that we depend on to do the particular analyses that we run. Most R packages have a way to cite them. There's even a tool built into R that allows you to do this, and it's not something that you see very often in papers. So I think that as science becomes more complicated in terms of the computational skills that it requires, in terms of the libraries and packages that we depend on to do interesting kinds of work, if we want to sustain that, then we have to recognize it, and we have to do that in the sort of academic-y way of citing the tools that we use.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised to hear that people do they not cite R packages? I thought that's how you do it. Because it is open source and you have to credit that work.
From my vantage point, it doesn't appear to be standard or normed. Like, number one, I don't think people are really that conscientious with their citations in the first place, which is a huge problem for citation justice overall. But,
it's something I care about a lot,
yes,
as you know.
Yes. But, I think that's sort of software, and these kind of softer contributions don't come to mind when people write a paper, and so there's an issue there. It's not we should be recognizing and rewarding this work, and mentioning how critical that contribution was to getting this research project off the ground. That doesn't come across enough.
It's so important for the people who are doing this kind of work, because it's the kind of thing that we can use to go to a funding agency and say, hey, if you want, there's lots of people using this. We need money to be able to hire somebody to work on this, to really accelerate it. Here's the 1,000 people who have used it in the past 5 years. That's enormously useful. And so that's just another reason to include a citation to the work that you're using.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know how it works in other countries now, but what I found out moving to the UK is that what people care about a lot here is impact. They care a lot about impact, and that's measured in different ways. And primarily it's impact on society. They don't really care if you're changing the research landscape. But I think there's an argument to be made about how open software can actually also have an impact on society, because we're changing the way knowledge is made. And, you can make that argument. But that would work really well in a context where that's what funders and promotion committees and stuff now care about. So I think that gives us an opportunity to potentially take that to our advantage. If it's something that, if you are someone who is developing software or has that skill and wants to do that, then that actually can work in certain research climates.
Were you thinking, Josh, about an alternative way of getting recognition or credit? Like, citations is one thing and one measure. Have you thought about or any possibilities or had any ideas about how else you might or would like to be recognized, or what structures in academia and science need to be changed to uplift or uphold this kind of contribution?
Ooh,
yeah, that's
a good question.
Yeah, that's cool. I haven't really thought deeply about what the alternatives would be, but I think that one of the things that we're kind of stuck in is that there's really only one way that we recognize the ideas and that we're building off of when we publish an article in a journal, and that's through citations. Would it be great if there were sort of an alternative way of saying here are some things, here's a citation in the sort of to a journal article, but also here's some software tools that were critical, or some methods that we built off of, and a way of recognizing those without the sort of corresponding need to have a journal article, because that's another interesting wrinkle that people deal with now, is that when I built jsPsych, I took the time to write an article about it. That article is basically useless now, because it's 10 years old. It describes I think version 2 of the software. It talks about all kinds of limitations that no longer exist. So it's interesting as a historical record, but it's not really descriptive of the actual software as it exists right now. And software tends to be more dynamic than that, right? We things change over time. You write a tutorial, it's out of date. So I don't know if the journal model really makes sense as a way to sort of say, I'm going to document what this piece of technology does or what this method is, and then people are going to cite that journal article. It would be lovely to have citations be to something like the software, which of course you can do. Like you can cite software as...
You can cite software.
Yeah, you can. But then the one issue is that those things don't get indexed. So if you're trying to track the impact of a software citation, it's really hard to find an aggregator who will say, yeah, this is how many times this particular piece of software has been cited. So Google Scholar won't track software citations, but they will track citations to a journal article about the software.
Yeah, you can't track number of uses or number of research papers that have used your software easily. Like that's not a thing that happens a lot.
Right. Whereas if there was a list and I could say, do a search that said, oh, just give me all the papers that, list jsPsych as a tool that was used, that would be fine. And I wouldn't, then citations wouldn't really matter. I can document the impact that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I'm going to take the conversation in a little bit of a different angle. What's next for jsPsych? Like, and also what's ongoing? Like, is there a lot of maintenance that needs to be done? Is like who's involved? Is there a lot of resources being invested in this? So what's the current state of jsPsych and what's the plan for the future?
Yeah. So we're at an interesting transition point right now. For the past 10 plus years, been operating under a model where, I've been the main driving force behind the project. There have been dozens of individual contributors to the project. And so I certainly wouldn't call it like a project that is solely my own at this point at all. But I'm the only sort of consistent person that's working on it. And right now we're really undergoing an effort to change that. So fortunate enough to get funding from the NSF through a program that's designed to take sort of well-established open source products and turn them into what we call an open source ecosystem. And an open source ecosystem would be something like R is a nice example of an open source ecosystem, right? It's a very sort of decentrally developed tool at this point. You've got things like the Tidyverse ecosystem, which is an ecosystem within the ecosystem. And these are all things that people can develop for and contribute to without going through sort of a central bottleneck. And that's really the model that we want to get to with jsPsych. We want to get to a model where I'm not the person that's solely responsible for decision making about the project. Where it's really seen as sort of a community resource and a community developed resource that has an advisory board that is helping to sort of make these long-term or medium-term decisions. And there are multiple maintainers who have privileges to access the code and change the code and release code and things like that. And so, we're in the early stages of this, but that's kind of where we're headed next. So in the next, 6 months or so, you should expect to see our website. We're gonna overhaul it to really make it clear how we imagine the sort of the structure of the project and how we imagine it as an ecosystem of sort of not like one thing. It's not just jsPsych, but it is a jsPsych ecosystem of different tools that can be used that all sort of play nicely together. And we're hoping that that and some additional training that we're going to be doing and some investment in the resources to make people more comfortable with contributing, that all of that is going to hopefully in the next year or two switch us from a model where it's one or two people to a model where it's a community of people.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm curious about two things. One is who is this community? Like, who do you envision being part of this community, and what kind of things initiatives might, shape this community, as well as for individuals who are interested in contributing to jsPsych, how can they become part of this community?
Yeah. So if you are a jsPsych user, you are potentially part of this community. And I don't mean that like in a sort of trite, like cliche way. That I mean it like, in order to write a jsPsych experiment, you have to write some code. And by writing code, you are potentially creating something that somebody else might benefit from access to. And what we want to do is help people figure out how to take that code that they've written for their lab or for their personal project and share it in a way that it is useful for others who would want to do similar kinds of things, and in ways that you can get recognized for that work that you are sharing. So if you implement a plugin that allows people to do something that they couldn't do before, we want to make sure that not only is jsPsych getting cited, but you as the developer of that plugin are also getting cited. So that's an initiative that we're actually actively working on right now, is how do we build sort of more robust citation tools into jsPsych so that you could say, create an experiment, and one of the things that it could output is a list of the sort of citations that we recommend you would include as acknowledging, like, hey, it's not just the core jsPsych package, but it's also these 4 plugins that these 4 different people developed, and they should get recognized too. Another initiative that we are thinking about is training. So there's lots of what do we say? Researchers as coders, or researchers who code.
Researchers who sometimes code.
Yeah, researchers sometimes code. So there's lots of people who have done amazing things with the coding that they're doing as researchers, who nevertheless feel somewhat shy or sheepish or embarrassed about like the state of the code that they've written, because they're not trained as software developers, and they're like, do I really want to contribute this code to an open source product where people can see what I've written? And so we want to think about, how do we reach those people and encourage them that, look, everybody's code sucks. It just sucks to different degrees, and like, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Like, if it works, it works, and that's great. You should go, if you ever want to see really crappy code, go onto GitHub and look at the jsPsych code that I released as the very first. You can go back all 14 years or whatever it is, and those first ones are awful. But they did the job, and so there's lots of really not pretty code that is actually quite good in the terms that it gets the functionality done. And so we want to think about, how do we work with those people to say, like, give them the confidence and the skills that they need to take those things that they've written and turn them into contributions that they can share in an open source way. So we're going to be running a couple hackathons over the next 2 years. Some of them will be in person. We're going to have some funding to bring people out to Vassar, and hopefully do sort of an all expenses paid hackathon here. So keep eyes out for that if that sounds interesting. And we're also going to do some virtual hackathons that'll be less resource intensive, but hopefully sort of equally informative about the practices and how to develop for the ecosystem rather than just develop for your individual projects or labs.
That all sounds really awesome. If I can add maybe an idea to that, another great non-profit organization is the Carpentries, who teaches people how to, who like software carpentry, data carpentry, and things like that. And their model involves people, volunteers, I think generally, who run sort of workshops, like the Carpentries workshops, teaching people's code, and they have like open source like workshop and tutorials ready to go. Essentially, you do a training course to become certified as someone who can give the workshops, and then you can take that workshop wherever. So that could be a fun idea for jsPsych, to have people be, well, what's the word? The word I'm not looking for is influencer, but ambassador. That's the one I'm looking for. jsPsych ambassadors, who can maybe spread the word, so to speak, and build that community up as well.
That'd be great.
You have one side for the developers and the maintainers, and then you also have people bringing people into the community and like lowering those barriers to get into jsPsych as well, via in-person, connection and networking.
Yeah, I love that idea. And another interesting case of like, how do you ensure that that is the kind of activity that like we'd want to encourage? So how do we reward it? And I don't know, but if I can do anything to make that a viable option for people to help train folks, I would love to figure that out.
It's a problem for reproducibility as well, because we're also trying to figure out how to get people to create open science communities at the local institutions via a very accessible method, like your journal club, providing them starter resources. But it's difficult to figure out a way to have people recognized for that really important community building, volunteer work that can shape people's science in very soft ways rather than very documented ways. Luckily, code has an advantage of being documented and version control and stuff, so that's helpful. What are some of the...
The Academy cares a lot about documenting, right?
Yeah, there's a lot that needs to change in that front. One thing I'm curious about... one idea that also sparked... Another thing that sparked for me, I think is one of the initiatives that jsPsych is running. I would love to build a museum of like cognitive science demos. Like, for example, imagine you have a website, people can click in and see the task that was run for particular studies. Like, this is what an NBAC task is, if you're looking at a working memory task, or this is what a visual search task is. They can do a demo themselves and they can see the code that built that thing. I think that would be great pedagogically, because if you're teaching a perception and cognition class,
oh my goodness,
they can. It's engaging, it's interactive, and they will have a better sense of what that task actually is when they do it, rather than read off a page describing it. And then secondly, I think it would help researchers, get into the landscape, run their own online studies, lower those barriers, because they can take something existing and for the researchers who sometimes code, they can edit the existing code rather than starting from scratch.
Yeah.
jsPsych, I believe, has a similar project on that front.
Yeah. So, earlier when I was describing jsPsych, I was talking about kind of how we abstract an experiment, which is into a series of sort of these small little tasks that you're doing throughout. But there's another level of abstraction above that, which is this is an experiment that involves an NBAC task, and it's 2-back, and it uses these kinds of stimuli, and this is the rate of of targets appearing and things like that. And sometimes it makes sense to abstract an experiment or a piece of an experiment at that level. I think a great example of this are certain kinds of survey instruments, right? We use certain kinds of standardized ways of measuring things that are maybe multi-page surveys that are like, this is just how you do it. And if you want to measure that thing, you put that into your experiment. And we don't really have a good way of abstracting that in jsPsych and making that easy to sort of reuse. So one of the things that we launched recently is a project called jsPsych Timelines. So a timeline in jsPsych is a collection of these tasks. And in this jsPsych Timelines project, we're making it so that you can write a flanker task, and you can parameterize it in the way that you might parameterize a plugin and say, this is, I want to use these kinds of stimuli. I want this many trials. I want this proportion of targets and distractors, or whatever the case may be. And we've come up with a way of sort of systematizing that so that anybody could write a timeline version of a task or a piece of a task and publish that like you would publish a plugin. And so a new experiment could then be a collection of these things. So you could have a new experiment that is something that you implement sort of at the level of the plugin and writing your own timeline. But then you could also just tack on, whatever the Stroop task is at the end of it or something like that, just based off of like the standard timeline implementation of those kinds of things. So yeah, this and part of my motivation for doing this was exactly this kind of idea of a lot of teaching demos and thinking also about the potential for some large scale citizen science data collection that might happen were you to have a museum of sort of cognitive experiments. And in developing that kind of project internally in the lab, we figured, well, we should probably think of how to make this something that is easy to add to and easy to adapt, and also make things more reusable.
I love that so much. It's I put out a question on Bluesky. It hasn't got many responses, but I think it's a great question. It's like, if you had any data set that just existed and like was in your hands right now, what would it be? Your perfect data set.
Yeah.
Not many responses so far, so people go to my Bluesky to respond. But yeah, I bet a lot of those idealized data sets would be big, citizen contributed, things like that. And like, okay, how do we get there? Have this sort of one good pathway seems to be an open source code that lives on a website like a museum, and people walk in or like, go browse that page and contribute a little bit by doing the task for a little bit, and suddenly we're growing, we're manufacturing this data set for us to have.
Yeah.
Right? Wouldn't that be exciting?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the model that I want to play with I'm at an institution where it's pretty teaching focused, and I got into this idea initially from the teaching angle. And one idea that I want to play with is, how do you make that experience in the classroom an engaging one? And the model that we're playing around with as we develop this app is a model where it's not just a demo of like, this is what an NBAC looks like or something like that, but it's a lightly gamified version of that. So imagine a sort of Kahoot style wrapper around these kinds of experiments where you could say, oh, you're doing this visual search task, and at the end of it, here's a leaderboard with a bunch of silly names for people, so that like you don't actually know who's who, but somebody knows like, oh, I did awesome on that task or whatever. Just ways to make things a little more fun.
Yeah, cool.
Would you be allowed to use that data? Because I'm pretty sure like I wouldn't be allowed in my institution because we don't have the formal ethics consent form, blah 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 blah. Like we have to have the entire thing in place, or then they won't let us otherwise.
Yeah, I think there's
some institutions are stricter than others, right? Like there's different ways of approaching this kind of stuff. We can't use any data that we've gathered in class.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there are restrictions in the U.S. about this too. There are so these kinds of manipulations would fall under this sort of this like benign behavioral intervention, and doing something like an NBAC task would be considered sort of exempt from like a human subjects review.
Yeah. Sarah, I've been asking a lot of questions. Do you have any that have come to mind that you wanted to ask?
No, not particularly. It's been really cool to hear more about this because I've heard of jsPsych, but I've never like really taken the time to like, get into it. So it's been cool to hear more about it, and it like makes me motivated to check it out some more.
Yeah. Josh, was there any last things that you wanted to mention or talk about jsPsych?
Yeah, I'll do one more sort of shout out for something that we're working on. So this is along the sort of open science stuff. So one kind of data collection model that I've been really enamored with and think has a lot of laudable characteristics is this idea of born open data. And so this is this idea where, as the data are collected, they are immediately open. And I think of this as a way of sort of automating a part of the process that is kind of annoying to deal with once the project is done, is sort of organizing your data set and getting it ready to go online and posting it to OSF or wherever it's going to go. And one way to, I think, increase the adoption of making more data open is just to make it so that it happens automatically. So a few years ago, I started working on a project to do this in sort of the jsPsych ecosystem. So we have a project called DataPipe, and it's at pipe.jspsych.org. And what DataPipe will do is it will automatically connect your jsPsych experiment to an OSF project. So as you collect data, those data files are not stored on your local computer or on some web server that you have to set up. Instead, they are just immediately sent to the OSF and they appear in an OSF project. And this is nice for both, the reason that it makes the data set just there on OSF. So then when it's time to publish, all you have to do is turn the repository from private to public. And it's a one-step thing to do that. Or you can make it public from the beginning. And that's great too. But it also it removes one of the big barriers, which is if you are running your experiments this way, then the OSF functions as your method of data storage. And so you no longer have to go through that process of like, how do I set up in my, a database at my university, or where am I going to save this data? Or am I going to use a commercial pay service to host my jsPsych experiments and things like that? So yeah, pipe.jspsych.org is that project, and I'm optimistic about it. But it's not super widely used yet. I haven't been publicizing it, so this might maybe cause the spike of activity. We'll see.
As a user of DataPipe, I highly vouch for it. I just used it for the first time recently, maybe to give my listeners a bit of an example of how it could be used. For this project, we collected data in a museum. So people coming by and then completing the task on an iPad, actually, which is another advantage of jsPsych. You can do it on mobile devices. And so, rather than trying to figure out a way to save the data locally on the iPad device that we would then extract and then put online, we used the DataPipe plugin, and we went straight to OSF, and I could look at the data and make sure things were okay and were running properly, and everything was there. It worked seamlessly, absolutely seamlessly. Just totally straightforward, went straight up, data was there, and I have it now. And it's ready to go whenever we eventually get to the publishing stage of that data set.
That's awesome.
And it totally gives me the vision of imagine someone having this website that automatically has the data born open, and so you have this leaderboard, and the data is just constantly building and it's big. Yeah. Of course, you need to build some guardrails. You want to maybe make sure the data is de-identified, for example, or whatnot. But once those barriers,
sort of question. So can you automate that? Because my first thought was, okay, so you can't collect any demographic information whatsoever, because under GDPR laws, we can't publish any of that stuff for good reason.
Yeah.
But there are laws on that in the UK, right? So it's
right. So
can you automatically de-identify stuff at the source?
Yeah. So one way you could solve this would be you could still send data to OSF through a private OSF component, and you could set it up so that DataPipe sends two sets of data. So one set of data could be linked to a de-identified ID that has all the behavioral data that you want to eventually publish with the article. And if you need demographic information, then that can go to another private component where that information is stored separately, that you never make it public.
Right. Okay. I'd be really interested to see how that would work for us institutionally.
Yeah.
And how they would become okay with it. But there's probably some way.
Yeah, I got some feedback after the initial release from users in Europe who were trying to work through GDPR related stuff. And so one of the things that DataPipe now supports is you can set the region of the OSF bucket that gets created, so that you can make sure it's not one of the US ones, it's one of the European ones. So there's stuff like that. But if somebody is trying to use it and their institution is saying we need this feature to be supported in order for it to be used, please let us know, because that's the kind of feedback that is super, super helpful for thinking about how we prioritize development goals and going forward.
Yeah, awesome. I guess this is a good place to sort of start to wrap up. One good launching spot off of that is, how do people get involved with jsPsych? Where can they make these sort of feature requests, things like that?
Yeah. So the website is a great place to start, jspsych.org. And most of our activity that we do, we try to do as much as possible sort of in the open, and we use GitHub to manage that. So if you go to the jsPsych website, there are links on it directly to the GitHub repository. There are actually several GitHub repositories, but there's links to the main one on the website. And in there, there is a tab near the top called Discussions. And that is just a kind of like a normal discussion forum that's just hosted on GitHub, and people are welcome to post questions. You'll see if you go there that there's lots of questions about how do I do X, Y, and Z, and we try to answer as many of those as possible. It's one of the sort of our long-term sustainability goals, is to figure out how do we deal with support, and how do we help people, because that's something that we really would like to be able to do more of. So yeah, feel free to ask questions there. Feel free to answer questions. If you know the answer to something that somebody is asking, that's always super appreciated. If you have ideas about features and things like that, or you want to report a bug, you can file an issue on GitHub. It's really straightforward, and we are super friendly to all of the people who do that. So don't worry about following a particular kind of format or anything like that. And if you're interested in learning about how to contribute, so let's say you've done some programming work in your lab and you've built some really cool stuff with jsPsych that you think other people might be into, but you have zero idea about how this GitHub thing works and how to contribute that and get it back into the community, we would love to help you work through that. That's going to be the focus of some of these hackathons that are coming up. And also just something that we would be more than happy to respond to in a discussion post. If you say, help me work through this step of contributing this, we'd absolutely love to do that.
Amazing.
Awesome. Yeah. Sarah, any final thoughts? Otherwise, where can we find you?
Me?
Yeah. Where can we find you? Yeah.
Well,
you're here.
So I'm not really on socials anymore. I mean, I have accounts, but I'm not active on them.
Okay.
Any platform. If you want to find out more about what I do in my lab, you can find my staff profile at the University of Lincoln, and that has links to my lab website and the socials that I have previously used.
Yeah, I totally get that. I'm floating around socials now. I'm off Twitter. I've deleted my Twitter account, and I'm on Bluesky now, so you can follow me at william.bsky.social on Bluesky. And I'm open to emails, actually, so if anyone wants to email me, william.nyam@adelaide.edu.au. Yeah, I think this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for coming on, Josh.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if there's any last shout outs you'd like to give, or let people know how they can find you, this is your moment.
Okay. I think I would just like to shout out the 100+ people who have done some kind of contribution to jsPsych. It really, I just want to emphasize how much of a collaborative project it has been, and I hope will continue to be that way. And if you want to get in touch with me, my contact info is on the jsPsych website, and I've also lurking on Bluesky. I think it's Josh de Leeuw at bsky.social. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on.
This is great. Thanks so much.
Bye.